I knew the moment I heard the scraping sound that something had gone horribly wrong outside my house in Evergreen, Colorado. It was February, and the snow had been falling heavily for 2 days straight, which meant the HOA snow removal crew was out in full force. I jumped up from my home office desk and rushed to the front window, my coffee mug still in hand, and what I saw made my blood boil. The massive plow truck was reversing away from my property line, and where my 4 beautiful decorative boulders had been positioned along the edge of my driveway, there was now just crushed rock and debris scattered across the snow. I threw on my boots and jacket, not even bothering to lace them up properly, and stormed outside into the cold morning air. The plow driver, a younger guy I had seen around the neighborhood a few times, had already moved on to the next street, probably hoping I had not noticed what just happened. But I noticed. Those boulders had cost me nearly $2,000, carefully selected from a landscaping supply company in Denver. They were Colorado red granite, each one weighing about 300 pounds, positioned specifically to prevent people from cutting across my lawn when they turned into the cul-de-sac. I spent the next hour in the freezing cold, documenting everything with my phone. Pictures from every angle, measurements of the debris field, close-ups of the tire tracks where the plow had clearly veered too far onto my property. My neighbor, an older gentleman named Robert, came out to see what happened and shook his head sympathetically. "That's the 3rd time this winter they've damaged someone's property," he said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Last month they took out the Hendersons' mailbox, and before that, they destroyed Mrs. Patterson's garden lights." I thanked him for the information and headed back inside, already composing the email I would send to the HOA board in my head. I had lived in Pine Ridge Estates for 3 years, and while the community was generally nice with well-maintained common areas and good neighbors, the HOA itself was run by a group of people who seemed to think they owned everyone's property, not just managed the common spaces. By that afternoon, I had sent a detailed email with all the photos attached to the HOA board, specifically addressing it to Patricia Morrison, the HOA president who had a reputation for being difficult. I kept my tone professional but firm, explaining what happened and requesting immediate reimbursement for the damage to my property. I even included receipts from when I originally purchased and had the boulders installed. The response came faster than I expected, but not in the way I hoped. Patricia called me directly at 6 in the evening, her voice dripping with condescension. "Mr. Yates, I received your email, but I'm afraid the HOA cannot be held responsible for this incident," she said without even a greeting. "Our snow removal contract specifically states that homeowners are responsible for ensuring their property does not interfere with snow removal operations." I felt my jaw clench. "Patricia, those boulders were completely on my property, a full 2 feet from the street. Your driver veered onto my land and destroyed them. That's your perspective, Owen." The driver reported that the boulders were positioned in a way that made it difficult to properly clear the street. "In fact, we're going to need you to refrain from placing any obstacles that could interfere with snow removal in the future." I could not believe what I was hearing. "Are you seriously telling me that I can't landscape my own property the way I want?" Those boulders were decorative elements that also protected my lawn from being damaged. "I'm telling you that community standards must be maintained, and anything that interferes with essential services like snow removal is not acceptable. Now, if you would like to discuss this further, you're welcome to attend the next board meeting in 2 weeks. Good evening, Owen." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there in my kitchen, phone still pressed to my ear, absolutely furious. This was not just about the money anymore. It was about the principle. The HOA had damaged my property, refused to take responsibility, and was now trying to dictate what I could do with my own land within my property boundaries. That night, I barely slept. I kept running through scenarios in my mind, thinking about how to handle this situation. By morning, I had decided on my course of action. If the HOA would not reimburse me for the destroyed boulders and was going to claim they interfered with snow removal, then I would replace them with something that truly made my point. I spent the entire weekend researching and making calls. What I found was perfect. A quarry outside of Loveland, Colorado, specialized in large landscaping stones, including massive granite boulders that were used for major landscaping projects and erosion control. When I explained what I wanted, the owner, a gruff but friendly man named Dave, actually laughed. "So let me get this straight," he said over the phone. "You want boulders big enough that nobody's going to mess with them, but still positioned legally on your property?" "Exactly. I want them positioned the same place as before, completely within my property lines, but substantial enough that they won't be pushed around by a plow. I've got just the thing. I have 4 boulders, each one weighing about 2 tons. They're beautiful specimens, real Colorado granite with pink and gray striations. They'll require special equipment to deliver and position, but once they're in place, they're not going anywhere unless someone brings in a crane." The price was steep, nearly $5,000 including delivery and professional placement, but I did not care anymore. I was making a statement. I scheduled the delivery for the following Thursday, giving me time to prepare the exact locations and ensure everything was documented. Tuesday morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA. It was a formal notice stating that I was in violation of the community landscaping standards for creating a visual obstruction, and that I needed to remove any debris from the boulder incident within 10 days or face a fine of $50 per day. The letter was signed by Patricia Morrison with her official HOA president title printed beneath her signature. I actually laughed out loud when I read it. They were trying to fine me for the mess they created. I immediately scanned the letter and added it to my growing file of documentation. I had already decided that if this escalated further, I would be consulting with a lawyer. But for now, I wanted to see how this played out. Thursday arrived with clear skies and cold temperatures, perfect conditions for the boulder installation. The delivery truck arrived at 9 in the morning, a massive flatbed with a specialized crane attachment. Dave himself had come along to oversee the installation, bringing a surveyor's measuring tool to ensure we positioned everything precisely within my property boundaries. Several neighbors came out to watch as the crane carefully lifted each enormous boulder into place. The stones were magnificent, each one roughly 4 feet in diameter, their surfaces naturally textured and colored in shades of pink, gray, and white. Dave and his crew worked meticulously, using the survey equipment to confirm that each boulder was positioned at least 2.5 feet from the street edge, well within my property line. Robert came over as they were positioning the final boulder. "Those are substantial," he said with barely concealed amusement. "I don't think anything's going to move those." "That's exactly the point," I replied. "I have every right to landscape my property as I see fit, as long as it's within my boundaries and doesn't violate any actual regulations." By noon, the installation was complete. Dave had me sign off on the work and handed me a detailed invoice that included precise measurements and GPS coordinates for each boulder's position. He also gave me a certificate of installation that documented the weight and specifications of each stone. "You know," Dave said as he was packing up his equipment. "In 30 years of doing this work, I've never had someone install boulders specifically because their HOA ticked them off. But I respect it. These beauties will be here long after that HOA board is gone." I spent the rest of the day taking photos and measurements, creating a comprehensive record of the new installation. I sent a polite email to the HOA board informing them that I had cleaned up the debris from their snow removal damage and had restored my landscaping in compliance with my property rights. I attached photos and the survey documentation showing that everything was properly positioned within my property boundaries. The response came the next morning, and it was not from Patricia. It was from the HOA's lawyer, a firm called Meadows and Associates, based in Denver. The letter stated that the new boulders were excessively large and constituted a potential hazard. It demanded their removal within 30 days and threatened legal action if I did not comply. This was escalating faster than I expected, but I was not backing down. I called a real estate attorney I had worked with when buying my house, Marcus Chen, and explained the entire situation. He listened carefully, asked several detailed questions about the HOA's covenants and restrictions, and requested that I send him all my documentation. 2 days later, Marcus called me back. "Owen, I've reviewed everything, and honestly, the HOA doesn't have a leg to stand on. Your boulders are entirely on your property. They don't violate any height restrictions or setback requirements, and they're not offensive or hazardous in any way. They're just large landscaping stones. The HOA is overreaching." "So what do?" I asked. "We respond to their lawyer with our own letter, making it clear that you're in full compliance with all applicable regulations, and that any attempt to force you to remove legally installed landscaping will result in a countersuit for harassment and the cost of damages from their snow plow. I'll draft something today." I felt relieved to have professional backing. Marcus sent the response letter that afternoon, and I was copied on it. The letter was politely worded but firm, laying out exactly why the HOA's demands were baseless, and noting that they had still not addressed the damage their snow removal contractor had caused to my original landscaping. For about a week, things were quiet. The weather had warmed up slightly, and most of the snow had melted, so there was no need for plowing. I went about my normal routine, working from home as a software developer and enjoying the sight of my impressive new boulders every time I looked out the front window. Then the snow came back with a vengeance. A late February storm dumped 18 inches on our neighborhood over a 48-hour period, and I knew the snow removal crews would be out in force. I found myself feeling oddly anticipatory, wondering if they would try to navigate around my new boulders or if something more interesting would happen. The plow came through at about 6 in the morning, and I was already awake, coffee in hand, watching from my window. It was a different truck this time, bigger and heavier than the one that had destroyed my original boulders. The driver made his first pass down our street without incident, pushing the snow to the sides efficiently. But then he started his second pass, coming back in the opposite direction. I watched as he approached my property, and I could see him trying to angle the plow closer to the curb to get a clean scrape. What happened next unfolded almost in slow motion. The edge of the plow blade caught the nearest boulder. There was a horrible screeching sound of metal on stone, and the entire truck jerked to the side. The plow blade bent visibly, folding back on itself as the truck's momentum carried it forward. The driver slammed on the brakes, and the truck skidded slightly before coming to a stop. I was already putting on my boots and jacket. By the time I got outside, the driver had climbed out of the cab and was standing there looking at the damage, his face pale in the early morning light. The plow blade was mangled, bent at an angle that made it completely useless. The boulder itself had not moved an inch. "What the hell is that thing made of?" the driver said when he saw me approaching. "It's a 2-ton granite boulder," I said calmly, "positioned entirely within my property boundaries as it has every right to be." "Man, nobody told me there were rocks this big here. The work order just said to clear Pine Ridge Estates like normal." I actually felt a bit bad for the driver. He was just doing his job, and this clearly was not his fault. "Did your supervisor mention anything about my property specifically?" "No, nothing. I just got the standard route assignment." We both stood there looking at the damaged plow for a moment before he pulled out his phone and called his supervisor. I could hear only one side of the conversation, but it was clear the supervisor was not happy. The driver kept explaining that there were massive boulders that were not there during previous plowing runs, and that nobody had warned him about them. After he hung up, he turned to me. "My supervisor wants your contact information and is calling the HOA. This is going to be a whole thing." "I'm sure it will be," I said, handing him my business card. "For what it's worth, I tried to handle this the right way after your company destroyed my original landscaping. The HOA refused to take responsibility. These boulders are perfectly legal and properly positioned." The driver nodded slowly. "Yeah, well, between you and me, this isn't the first time the HOA has created problems for us. Last year they threatened to cancel our contract if we didn't plow closer to the curbs, even in areas where people have mailboxes and stuff right at the edge. It's like they want us to hit things." That was an interesting piece of information. Before I could respond, another truck pulled up, this one a regular pickup with the snow removal company's logo on the door. A man in his 50s got out, looking irritated. "I'm Greg Foster, operations manager for Rocky Mountain Snow Services," he said, walking up to assess the damage. He took one look at the boulder and the bent plow blade and let out a long whistle. "That's one hell of a rock." "That's one hell of a plow blade bent up on my property," I countered. Greg looked at me sharply. "Your property? Those boulders are positioned well within my property line. I have survey documentation and GPS coordinates if you would like to verify." Greg pulled out a tablet from his truck and spent a few minutes looking at what I assumed were property maps and plat documents. His expression shifted from irritation to resignation. "You're Owen Yates?" he asked. "I am." "Yeah, I've got a note here in our system about your address. Added just 3 days ago. Says to use caution around large decorative boulders on the property." He turned to glare at his driver. "Did you not check the route notes before starting?" The driver looked sheepish. "I did, but I was looking at last week's route sheet because the new one didn't download properly." Greg rubbed his face with his hand, clearly frustrated. "Great, just great." He turned back to me. "Look, Mr. Yates, I understand there's been an ongoing issue between you and the HOA regarding these boulders. I don't want my company getting caught in the middle of whatever dispute you have with them." "That's fair," I said. "But your driver damaged his equipment by hitting an obstacle that was entirely on my private property. That's not my liability." "I'm not saying it is. I'm just trying to figure out how we proceed from here. That plow truck is out of commission until we can get the blade replaced or repaired, which is going to cost several $1,000s and leave us short a truck during peak season." We stood there in the cold for a few moments, none of us quite sure what to say next. Finally, Greg spoke again. "I'm going to need to contact the HOA and our insurance company. In the meantime, I'll need photos and measurements of everything." "I have no problem with that," I said. "I'll even provide you with copies of my survey documentation showing the boulder positions if it helps." Greg seemed surprised by my cooperation. That would actually be helpful, thanks. I went inside and printed out the documents Dave had provided, along with my own measurements and photos. When I returned, Greg was on the phone, having what sounded like a heated conversation with someone. He wrapped up the call as I approached. "Was that the HOA?" I asked, handing him the documents. "Yeah, I spoke with Patricia Morrison. She's insisting that your boulders are a hazard and that we should submit a damage claim against you." He looked down at the papers I had given him. "But looking at this documentation, I don't think that's going to fly. These are clearly positioned on your property. The HOA destroyed my original landscaping boulders when they plowed them in early February. I replaced them with these after they refused to take responsibility or reimburse me for the damage. Everything I've done is legal and properly documented." Greg nodded slowly. "Yeah, this is way above my pay grade. I'm going to let the insurance companies sort it out. But I'll tell you something off the record. We've had nothing but problems with this HOA. They're demanding and unreasonable, and they keep changing requirements without proper notice. Our contract is up for renewal in April, and we're seriously considering not bidding on it again." That was very interesting information. After Greg and his driver left, with the damaged plow truck being towed away, I went back inside and sent a detailed email to Marcus, my lawyer, explaining what had happened. He responded within an hour, saying this actually strengthened my position, and that the HOA would have a very difficult time arguing that I had done anything wrong. But Patricia Morrison was not one to give up easily. That afternoon, I received another certified letter, this one stating that the HOA was imposing an immediate fine of $500 for creating a hazardous condition that resulted in property damage. It also stated that I had 72 hours to remove the boulders or face additional daily fines of $100. I forwarded the letter to Marcus immediately. His response was swift and decisive. He drafted a formal legal response on his firm's letterhead, stating that the fines were baseless and unenforceable, that I was in full compliance with all regulations, and that any attempt to collect these fraudulent fines would result in legal action for harassment and abuse of authority. He also noted that the HOA still had not addressed their liability for the original damage they caused. Marcus sent copies of his letter to Patricia Morrison, the HOA's legal counsel, and all the other members of the HOA board. He also advised me to attend the upcoming HOA board meeting, which was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, to address the situation publicly. The week leading up to the meeting was tense. I received several more letters from the HOA, each one more aggressive than the last, threatening liens on my property and legal action. Marcus responded to each one methodically, building a paper trail that documented the HOA's overreach and harassment. I also did some research on HOA law in Colorado, and was pleased to discover that the state had fairly strong protections for homeowners against abusive HOA practices. There were specific statutes about proper procedures for fines and enforcement actions, and it was clear that Patricia and the board were not following them. Thursday evening arrived, and I drove to the community center where the HOA meetings were held. Marcus had decided to come with me, which I appreciated. The meeting room was more crowded than usual. Apparently word had spread about the boulder controversy, and several neighbors had shown up to see what would happen. Patricia Morrison sat at the front table with 4 other board members, all of them middle-aged homeowners who looked like they took their volunteer positions very seriously. Patricia was exactly what I expected. Perfectly styled blonde hair, expensive casual clothing, and an expression that suggested she smelled something unpleasant. The meeting started with routine business, approval of the previous meeting's minutes, budget updates, and discussions about upcoming landscaping projects in the common areas. I sat patiently through it all, knowing that my issue was listed under homeowner disputes later in the agenda. Finally, Patricia called on my situation. We have an ongoing issue with Owen Yates of 2847 Brookstone Drive regarding unauthorized landscaping installations that have resulted in property damage and safety concerns. I raised my hand. I'd like to address the board regarding that characterization. Patricia looked like she wanted to refuse, but several other board members nodded, so she gestured for me to come to the front. Marcus stood and came with me. "Thank you," I began, keeping my voice calm and professional. "I want to clarify several facts that seem to have been misrepresented." In early February, the HOA's snow removal contractor drove onto my property and destroyed 4 decorative boulders that were legally positioned within my property boundaries. I immediately documented the damage and submitted a claim to the HOA for reimbursement. That claim was denied, and I was told that my landscaping interfered with snow removal, despite being entirely on my private property. I paused and pulled out my folder of documentation. I then replaced those boulders with larger ones, again positioned entirely within my property boundaries, as confirmed by professional survey equipment. I have GPS coordinates, photographs, and measurements documenting their legal placement. The HOA has since sent me multiple letters demanding their removal and imposing fines, none of which follow proper procedures under Colorado HOA law. Patricia tried to interrupt, but one of the other board members, a man named Stephen, held up his hand to stop her. "Let him finish." Recently, a snow plow damaged its equipment by running into one of my boulders. The plow driver has confirmed that the boulder is on my property and that he received inadequate information about route hazards. The HOA is now trying to hold me liable for damage that occurred when commercial equipment struck an obstacle on my private property. This is clear overreach, and my attorney is prepared to take legal action if these harassment tactics continue. Marcus stepped forward. "I'm Marcus Chen, Mr. Yates' legal counsel. The documentation clearly shows that my client has acted within his rights throughout this situation. The HOA's attempts to impose fines without following proper procedures, their refusal to address the original property damage they caused, and their threats of liens and legal action all constitute harassment and potential abuse of authority. We're prepared to file suit if necessary, but we're hoping this can be resolved reasonably." The room was silent for a moment. Then Stephen, the board member who had told Patricia to let me finish, spoke up. "I'd like to see that documentation." I handed him the folder, and he spent several minutes reviewing it with the board member sitting next to him, a woman named Margaret. They whispered back and forth, pointing at various documents. Finally, Stephen looked up. "Patricia, did you review any of this documentation before sending those letters?" Patricia's face flushed slightly. "The documentation is irrelevant. The boulders are clearly excessive and create a safety hazard." "They're rocks," Margaret said flatly. "Large rocks positioned on his property. People have large landscaping features all over this neighborhood. The Hendersons have that massive fountain that's got to weigh more than these boulders combined." "That's different," Patricia insisted. "The fountain is decorative and doesn't interfere with community operations." "Neither do my boulders," I interjected. "They sit on my property, harming no one. The only reason there's been any issue is because the snow plow driver veered onto my property, just like he did when he destroyed my original boulders." Another board member, a quiet man named Thomas, spoke up for the first time. "I've driven past Owen's house several times since he installed the new boulders. They're actually quite attractive and clearly positioned well back from the street. I don't see what the problem is." Patricia was visibly frustrated now. "The problem is that he installed them without HOA approval. Our CC and Articus require approval for any major landscaping changes." Marcus jumped on that immediately. "Actually, the CC and Articus require approval only for structures and installations in common areas, or that violate specific restrictions. Landscaping elements on private property that don't exceed height limitations or create actual nuisances are not subject to pre-approval." "I've reviewed your governing documents thoroughly." Stephen nodded. "He's right. I just reviewed the CC and Articus last month for an unrelated matter. Landscaping elements like trees, shrubs, and rocks don't require pre-approval unless they violate a specific restriction, which these clearly don't." Patricia looked like she wanted to argue further, but it was clear she was losing support from the rest of the board. Margaret turned to her with a stern expression. "Patricia, I think we need to have a board discussion about this in executive session. We may have acted too hastily." She looked at me and Marcus. "Mr. Yates, Mr. Chen, thank you for presenting this information. We'll review it and provide a formal response within 2 weeks." Patricia clearly wanted to object, but she was outvoted. The board moved to table the discussion and moved on to other business. Marcus and I returned to our seats, and I felt a small sense of victory. At least some of the board members were being reasonable. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to me. Robert was there, along with the Hendersons and a few others I recognized from around the neighborhood. "Good for you," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "Patricia has been out of control for years. Someone needed to stand up to her." "I heard she tried to fine the Martins for painting their front door the wrong shade of white," another neighbor added. "The wrong shade of white. It's insane." These conversations revealed something I had suspected. Patricia Morrison had been abusing her position as HOA president for quite some time, and many residents were frustrated, but had not wanted to deal with the conflict of confronting her. My boulder situation had apparently become a rallying point. Over the next few days, I received emails from several neighbors expressing support and sharing their own stories of HOA overreach under Patricia's leadership. One couple had been fined for having their garbage cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours, even though they had been at work and could not bring them in immediately. Another family had been threatened with legal action for parking their camper in their driveway for 2 days while preparing for a vacation, despite no specific restriction against it in the CC and Articus. I forwarded these emails to Marcus, thinking they might be useful if this situation escalated further. He agreed and suggested that if it came to litigation, we could potentially build a case for a pattern of harassment and abuse of authority. The 2-week deadline came and went without any response from the HOA board. I continued my normal routine, occasionally glancing out at my impressive granite boulders and feeling a sense of satisfaction. They really were beautiful, and several neighbors had complimented them during walks through the neighborhood. Then, 3 weeks after the board meeting, I received a formal letter from the HOA. It was signed by Stephen, Margaret, and Thomas, but notably not by Patricia or the 5th board member, a woman named Donna who had not spoken during the meeting but had seemed to support Patricia's position. The letter stated that, after thorough review, the board had determined that my boulders were in compliance with all applicable regulations and restrictions. It withdrew all fines and threats of legal action. However, it did not address my original claim for reimbursement for the destroyed landscaping, nor did it acknowledge any wrongdoing by the HOA. I called Marcus immediately. "It's a partial victory," he said after I read him the letter. "They're backing down on the harassment, which is good. But they're not taking responsibility for the original damage. We could push for that, but it might mean actual litigation." "How much would litigation cost?" I asked. "For something like this, probably $5,000 to $10,000, maybe more if it drags out. And there's no guarantee we'd recover your costs even if we won, depending on how the judge ruled." I thought about it for a long moment. The principle of the thing still bothered me, but I also had to be practical. I had already spent $5,000 on the new boulders and several thousand on legal fees. Did I want to potentially double that cost for a case that might only recover $2,000 in damages? "Let's send one more letter," I decided, demanding reimbursement for the original boulders and payment of my legal fees to date. If they refuse, we'll consider whether to push forward. Marcus drafted a letter that afternoon, laying out the timeline of events, the clear liability of the HOA's contractor for the original damage, and a demand for $3,500, which covered the destroyed boulders and a portion of my legal costs. He gave them 2 weeks to respond. The response came from the HOA's lawyer rather than the board itself. It was a settlement offer. The HOA would pay $1,500 to resolve the matter completely, with no admission of liability. In exchange, I would need to sign a release agreeing not to pursue any further claims related to the boulder incidents. I did not like the no admission of liability clause, but Marcus pointed out that this was standard in settlement agreements. $1,500 would not cover all my costs, but it would at least partially offset them, and more importantly, it would end the ongoing conflict. "There's something else to consider," Marcus said during our phone call. "I've been hearing through professional channels that there's significant discord within your HOA board. Apparently, Patricia Morrison is facing a potential recall vote. Several homeowners are circulating a petition." That was news to me, though not entirely surprising given the conversations I had after the board meeting. How does that affect this situation? If Patricia is removed from the board, you might have a more reasonable group of people to work with going forward. Accepting this settlement gets the legal matter resolved, and you can focus on making sure the board changes for the better. He made a good point. I agreed to the settlement terms, and within a week, I received a check from the HOA for $1,500. I deposited it and considered the legal matter closed, though I remained vigilant about any future HOA overreach. The recall petition against Patricia Morrison gained momentum quickly. It turned out that my situation had been the catalyst for many frustrated neighbors to finally speak up about her authoritarian management style. Within a month, the petition had gathered more than enough signatures to trigger a recall vote under the HOA's bylaws. Patricia fought back aggressively. She sent letters to all homeowners defending her actions and claiming that the recall was being pushed by a small group of troublemakers who wanted to undermine community standards. She specifically mentioned my boulder situation as an example of homeowners trying to flout reasonable rules. This backfired spectacularly. Several neighbors who had been neutral or unaware of the issues were now motivated to learn more, and what they discovered was a pattern of petty enforcement actions, selective application of rules, and financial decisions made without proper board votes. Someone discovered that Patricia had approved a contract with a landscaping company owned by her brother-in-law without disclosing the conflict of interest. The recall vote was held in early April, and it was not even close. Patricia was removed from the board by a vote of 73% of participating homeowners. Donna, who had consistently supported Patricia's positions, resigned from the board voluntarily rather than face her own potential recall. The remaining board members, Stephen, Margaret, and Thomas, appointed 2 new members to fill the vacancies. Robert, my neighbor who had been supportive throughout the Boulder situation, and a younger woman named Jennifer who had recently moved to the neighborhood and had experience in nonprofit governance. The new board configuration was immediately different in tone and approach. Their first action was to review all outstanding compliance issues and fines, and they discovered that Patricia had imposed nearly $30,000 in fines over the past year, most of them for minor violations, and many without following proper procedures. The board voted to rescind virtually all of them. They also commissioned an independent audit of the HOA's finances, which revealed that Patricia had been making expenditures without proper board approval and had failed to properly document several $1,000s in spending. While there was no evidence of outright theft, the financial management had been sloppy at best. I watched all of this unfold with a sense of vindication. My Boulder situation had been the spark that exposed much larger problems within the HOA's governance. The new board seemed committed to transparency and following proper procedures, which was all that most homeowners wanted. In May, the snow had long since melted, and my granite boulders sat peacefully at the edge of my property, now surrounded by spring flowers I had planted around their bases. They had become something of a neighborhood landmark, and several other homeowners had asked me for Dave's contact information because they wanted their own impressive landscaping stones. The new HOA board reached out to Rocky Mountain Snow Services to negotiate a contract for the next winter season. Greg Foster, the operations manager I had met during the Plow damage incident, told me later that the negotiations were refreshingly professional and reasonable. They agreed on clear protocols for handling property damage, proper notification of route hazards, and fair liability standards. One evening in late May, I was working in my front yard, adding some additional plantings around the boulders when Margaret from the HOA board stopped by during her evening walk. "Owen, I wanted to personally apologize for how the board handled your situation initially," she said. "We should have supported your rights as a homeowner from the beginning instead of letting Patricia run roughshod over reasonable concerns." "I appreciate that," I replied, standing up and brushing dirt from my hands. "I never wanted to be in conflict with the HOA. I just wanted my property rights respected. You did the neighborhood a favor, even if it did not feel like it at the time. Patricia needed to be held accountable, and your willingness to push back gave others the courage to speak up about their own concerns." She looked at the boulders appreciatively. "These really are beautiful, by the way. They add character to the neighborhood." After she left, I stood there looking at my handiwork. The boulders had cost me time, money, and significant stress, but in the end, they had accomplished exactly what I wanted. They protected my property, they looked great, and they had exposed a dysfunctional power dynamic within the HOA that needed to be addressed. Summer arrived in full force, and life in Pine Ridge Estates settled into a comfortable rhythm. The new HOA board operated transparently, sending regular updates to homeowners and making themselves available for questions and concerns. They revised the CC and Articus to clarify ambiguous sections and remove outdated restrictions that no longer made sense. I continued to work from home, occasionally glancing out my window at the massive boulders that had caused such controversy. They had weathered into the landscape beautifully, looking like they had always been there. Birds perched on them in the mornings, and sometimes I would see children playing around them during afternoon walks with their parents. In July, the HOA organized a neighborhood barbecue in the common area park, something they had not done in years. The atmosphere was noticeably different from previous community events. People seemed more relaxed, more willing to chat with board members, less worried about being judged for minor violations of arbitrary rules. Robert came over to where I was standing with a plate of food. "You know, I've lived here for 15 years and this is the first community event I've actually enjoyed," he said. "People aren't stressed about whether their lawn is the perfect height or if they're parking correctly. They're just being neighbors. That's how it should be," I agreed. "An HOA should facilitate community, not create anxiety." "Well, your boulder battle certainly changed things around here. I'm not sure you realized what you were starting when you installed those rocks," I laughed. "I definitely did not. I just wanted to replace my destroyed landscaping and make a point about property rights." As fall approached, I started thinking about the upcoming winter and wondering if there would be any issues with snow removal around my boulders. The new board had been proactive, though, sending out detailed information about snow removal procedures and asking homeowners to document any unique features on their properties that contractors should be aware of. I submitted my information, including updated photos and measurements of the boulders, and received a prompt acknowledgement from the board. They assured me that all contractors would be properly briefed on route hazards, and that property respect was a key component of any service contracts. The first significant snow of the season came in early November, and I found myself watching from my window as the plow trucks made their rounds. The driver approached my property carefully, giving the boulders a wide berth and still managing to clear the street effectively. No drama, no damage, just professional work done properly. I sent a brief email to the HOA board complimenting the snow removal service, and Stephen responded thanking me for the feedback and noting that they had received several similar positive comments from other homeowners. It was a small interaction, but it represented such a stark contrast to the contentious relationship under Patricia's leadership. In December, I received an unexpected piece of mail, a holiday card from the HOA board, signed by all 5 members, wishing me and all residents a peaceful holiday season. It was a simple gesture, but it symbolized the changed culture within the neighborhood governance. I reflected on everything that had happened over the past year as I sat in my living room on New Year's Eve, looking out at the snow-covered boulders illuminated by my landscape lighting. What had started as a frustrating incident of property damage had evolved into a neighborhood-wide reckoning with HOA governance and ultimately resulted in positive change for everyone. The boulders themselves had become more than just landscaping features. They were a reminder that standing up for your rights, even when it is difficult and expensive, can have ripple effects beyond your immediate situation. They represented the principle that HOAs exist to serve homeowners, not to control them, and that community standards should be reasonable and fairly applied. As winter progressed, I settled into a comfortable routine. The HOA sent out monthly newsletters with transparent financial information, upcoming projects, and opportunities for homeowner input. Board meetings were well attended and conducted with professionalism and respect for different viewpoints. In February, almost exactly 1 year after the original boulder incident, I received an email from Marcus Chen checking in on how things were going. I wrote back explaining the transformation in the HOA and thanking him for his support during the difficult period. "Glad to hear it worked out," he replied. "Your case was interesting because it highlighted how easily HOAs can overstep their authority when there are not proper checks and balances. You did everything right, documented everything, knew your rights, and stood firm on legitimate principles. More homeowners should be willing to do the same when faced with unreasonable HOA actions. March brought the anniversary of the recall vote that had removed Patricia Morrison from the board. The neighborhood had come a long way in that year. Property values had actually increased slightly, in part because the HOA's reputation had improved, and potential buyers were no longer scared off by stories of aggressive enforcement and arbitrary fines. I learned through the neighborhood gossip network that Patricia had moved out of Pine Ridge Estates in January, selling her house and relocating to a different community in Colorado Springs. I felt no particular satisfaction at this news, only relief that the source of so much unnecessary conflict was gone. Spring arrived again, and I spent time refreshing the plantings around my boulders, adding some colorful perennials that would bloom throughout the summer. Neighbors walking by would often stop to chat, complimenting the landscaping and sometimes sharing their own stories about dealing with HOA issues in the past. One afternoon in April, I was outside trimming back some overgrown shrubs when a young couple walking past stopped to admire the boulders. They introduced themselves as potential buyers looking at a house 3 streets over. "These are beautiful," the woman said. "Are decorative features like this common in the neighborhood?" "They're becoming more popular," I replied. "The HOA here is pretty reasonable about landscaping choices as long as everything is on your property and doesn't violate any legitimate restrictions." "That's good to hear," the man said. "We were worried because we heard there had been some HOA drama in the past." "There was," I admitted. "But the board changed, and things are much better now. They focus on maintaining common areas and handling genuine community issues rather than micromanaging individual properties." They thanked me for the information and continued their walk. I hoped they decided to buy in the neighborhood. People who appreciated reasonable governance and personal property rights were exactly the kind of neighbors who made a community function well. As summer returned, I reflected on how much had changed in just over a year. My 4 massive granite boulders sat exactly where I had placed them, unmoved and unbothered, serving their purpose perfectly. They protected my lawn from vehicles cutting across it. They added aesthetic value to my property, and they stood as a permanent reminder that homeowners have rights that must be respected. The HOA continued to function smoothly under the new board's leadership. They tackled legitimate community issues like maintaining the pool and common areas, addressing drainage problems in certain parts of the neighborhood, and organizing community events that people actually enjoyed attending. I had settled all my legal matters, recovered some of my costs through the settlement, and most importantly, had established a precedent that the HOA could not simply bully homeowners into compliance with unreasonable demands. Other residents had taken note and felt empowered to question decisions that did not make sense or to push back against overreach. In August, I received a letter from the HOA board asking if I would be interested in serving on one of the committees that advised the board on various issues. They were forming a new compliance review committee to ensure that any enforcement actions followed proper procedures and were based on legitimate violations of clearly stated rules. I was tempted to decline, not wanting to get more involved in HOA politics, but then I realized that this was exactly how positive change happened. Engaged homeowners who understood the importance of fair governance needed to participate in the process. I accepted the position and attended my first committee meeting in September. The committee consisted of 5 homeowners with diverse backgrounds and perspectives. Our charter was clear: Review all proposed enforcement actions before they were sent to homeowners. Ensure they cited specific, applicable rules. Verify that proper procedures were followed. And recommend dismissal of any actions that appeared arbitrary or vindictive. It was fascinating work, and it gave me insight into how easily HOA enforcement could go wrong without proper oversight. We reviewed several proposed violation notices in our first few meetings, and we sent about a third of them back to the board with recommendations to dismiss or modify them because they did not meet our standards for legitimate enforcement. One case was particularly similar to my own situation. A homeowner had installed a decorative fence on their property, and someone had complained that it was not in keeping with neighborhood aesthetics. The proposed violation notice demanded the fence be removed within 30 days. Our committee reviewed the CC and RTCS, examined photos of the fence, and determined that it violated no specific restriction and was entirely on the homeowner's property. We recommended the complaint be dismissed, and the board agreed. Fall arrived again, bringing cooler temperatures and the changing colors of Colorado's deciduous trees. I had fully integrated back into normal life, with the boulder incident now just an interesting story I occasionally told when conversation turned to HOA topics. The neighborhood Halloween party, organized by the HOA, was the best-attended community event in years. Children ran around in costumes, parents socialized over hot cider, and board members mingled naturally with residents without any sense of hierarchy or tension. It was exactly what an HOA should facilitate: genuine community connection. As winter approached once again, I felt completely confident that snow removal would proceed smoothly. The HOA had maintained their contract with Rocky Mountain Snow Services, and the relationship was professional and respectful on all sides. My boulders were properly documented in their system, and I had no concerns about any repeats of the previous year's drama. The first snow came in mid-November, and I watched from my window as the plow efficiently cleared our street, navigating around my boulders without any issue. It was almost anticlimactic after all the excitement of the previous year, but that was exactly how it should be: boring, professional, and drama-free. December brought holiday decorations throughout the neighborhood, and I added some tasteful lights to the landscaping around my boulders. They actually provided excellent anchor points for hanging certain decorations, which was an unexpected bonus. Several neighbors complimented the display during evening walks. On New Year's Eve, I once again found myself looking out at the snow-covered boulders, now 2 years since I had first started this journey. So much had changed, not just for me but for the entire community. The HOA functioned as it should, serving rather than controlling. Homeowners felt respected rather than harassed. The neighborhood was thriving. I thought about Patricia Morrison occasionally, wondering if she had found a new community where her management style was better received, or if she had learned anything from being recalled. I hoped for the latter, but I suspected it was probably the former. Some people never learned that leadership through fear and control was unsustainable. January brought a neighborhood meeting to discuss upcoming projects and budget priorities for the year. The meeting was well attended and constructive, with real discussions about trade-offs and priorities. When the board presented options for upgrading the playground equipment in the common area versus repaving some of the walking paths, there was genuine debate and thoughtful consideration of different perspectives. I participated in the discussion, offering my thoughts on prioritizing safety for children using the playground. The board listened respectfully. Other homeowners chimed in with their views, and ultimately a vote was taken showing clear support for the playground upgrades. The whole process felt healthy and democratic, exactly what community governance should look like. In February, the second anniversary of the original boulder destruction arrived. I took a moment that morning to look at my 4 massive granite boulders, still sitting exactly where they had been placed, weathered slightly by 2 years of Colorado seasons but essentially unchanged. They had served me well, protecting my property and standing as silent witnesses to a neighborhood transformation. A new family had moved into Patricia Morrison's old house, a young couple with 2 small children. They had stopped by to introduce themselves shortly after moving in, and I had welcomed them warmly. They asked about the boulders during that first conversation, having heard some version of the story from other neighbors. So these caused a whole thing with the HOA. The husband had asked, looking at them with newfound respect. They were the catalyst, I had explained. But the real issue was about property rights, fair governance, and holding leadership accountable. The boulders were just the visible symbol of those principles. As spring approached in this second year after the incident, life had fully returned to normal, or rather, to a better normal than had existed before. The HOA functioned well, the neighborhood was pleasant, and my boulders remained exactly where they belonged, on my property, looking impressive and bothering no one. I had learned several valuable lessons through this experience. First, documentation was crucial when dealing with any bureaucratic entity. Every photo, every email, every measurement I had taken proved invaluable in defending my rights. Second, knowing the actual rules and regulations, rather than accepting someone's interpretation of them, was essential. Third, standing up for legitimate principles, even when it was difficult and expensive, could create positive change that extended far beyond your immediate situation. Marcus Chen had been right when he said that more homeowners should be willing to push back against unreasonable HOA actions. But I also understood why many people did not. It required time, money, stress tolerance, and a willingness to be seen as difficult or confrontational. Not everyone was in a position to take on that fight. That was why the Compliance Review Committee I now served on was so important. By creating an institutional check on HOA enforcement actions, we helped protect homeowners who might not have the resources or inclination to fight back against unreasonable demands. We were building a culture of fairness into the HOA's operations. In March, I attended a regional HOA conference in Denver that the board had invited committee members to attend. It was eye-opening to hear presentations about best practices in HOA governance, and to talk with board members and homeowners from other communities about their experiences. One presenter discussed the importance of remembering that HOAs were created to serve homeowners, not to control them. She emphasized that the best HOAs focused on maintaining property values through well-managed common areas, and even-handed enforcement of reasonable restrictions, not through aggressive micromanagement of individual properties. Another session focused on conflict resolution and de-escalation techniques. The presenter shared case studies of HOA disputes that had spiraled out of control, sometimes ending in litigation that cost both sides tens of thousands of dollars over issues that could have been resolved with better communication and willingness to compromise. I thought about my own situation and realized that I had been fortunate in some ways. Yes, I had spent money on legal fees and replacement boulders, but the total cost was manageable and the situation had resolved relatively quickly. Some of the case studies involved disputes that dragged on for years, destroying neighborhood relationships and creating lasting animosity. By summer, My role on the compliance committee had become routine. We met monthly, reviewed proposed enforcement actions, and occasionally dealt with appeals from homeowners who had received violation notices. Most of our work was straightforward, but every so often we would catch an action that was clearly motivated by personal conflicts or misunderstandings rather than legitimate rule violations. One case involved a neighbor dispute where one homeowner had complained about another's dog barking. The complainant wanted the HOA to fine the dog owner and force them to get rid of the dog. We reviewed the CC and Articus and found that they addressed only dangerous animals and required that pets be kept on leashes in common areas. There was no provision about barking or noise complaints, as those were matters for local animal control or police. We recommended that the board inform both homeowners that this was not an HOA matter and suggest they work it out between themselves or involve appropriate municipal authorities. The board agreed, and while neither homeowner was thrilled with the response, it was the correct application of the HOA's limited authority. As fall arrived again, I realized that I had been living with my massive boulders for more than 2.5 years. They had become such a normal part of my landscape that I sometimes forgot they had once been controversial. New residents who had moved in during the past year often did not even know the history. They just saw them as nice landscaping features. The Halloween party that year was even better attended than the previous one, with the HOA board organizing a costume contest and pumpkin carving station. I helped set up some of the activities and spent the evening chatting with neighbors, many of whom I had gotten to know much better through my committee work and increased community involvement. Robert found me near the end of the evening. "You know, Owen, when you first moved in here, I never would have pegged you as someone who would end up being so involved in HOA stuff. But I'm glad you are. We need people who understand the importance of balance between community standards and individual rights." I never planned on it, I admitted. But once you go through something like the boulder situation, you realize how important good governance is. I'd rather put in some time to help maintain that than risk sliding back into the problems we had before. As another winter approached, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction with how things had turned out. My property was exactly as I wanted it, with impressive landscaping features that I enjoyed every day. The HOA was functioning well, serving the community rather than creating unnecessary conflict. And I had played a role in making that transformation happen, even if it had not been my initial intention. The snow removal that winter proceeded without incident, just as it had the previous year. The plow trucks came through after each storm, efficiently cleared the streets while respecting property boundaries, and I never gave it a second thought. That was exactly how it should be: routine, professional, and boring. As I sat in my living room on another New Year's Eve, now approaching 3 years since the original incident, I reflected on the entire journey. Those 4 massive granite boulders sitting outside in the snow represented so much more than landscaping. They were a testament to the principle that homeowners have rights that must be respected. They were a reminder that standing up to unreasonable authority can create positive change. They were proof that communities function better when governance is fair, transparent, and focused on genuine service rather than control. I raised my glass in a private toast to those boulders and to the unexpected journey they had taken me on. Then I settled in to watch the fireworks display that the HOA was sponsoring in the common area, another sign of how much things had improved. Life in Pine Ridge Estates was good, and I had every reason to believe it would stay that way. The boulders would remain exactly where they were, massive and immovable, protecting my property and standing as permanent reminders that sometimes the right response to having something destroyed is to replace it with something even stronger. It was a lesson that applied to much more than just landscaping, and it was one I would carry with me for the rest of my life. As the fireworks lit up the Colorado sky that night, I felt genuinely grateful for how everything had worked out. The path had not been easy, and there had been moments when I questioned whether the fight was worth it. But standing here now, in a thriving community with fair governance and good neighbors, I knew without a doubt that it had been worth every dollar spent, every stressful moment endured, and every hour invested in making things better. My 4 massive granite boulders sat peacefully in the snow outside, exactly where they belonged, and I could not imagine my property without them. They had become part of my home's character, part of the neighborhood's landscape, and part of a story that would probably be told to new residents for years to come. And that was just fine with me.